For this project, I'm going to be talking about the cultural considerations in SLP work. And the two articles that I read were The Road to Cultural Competence by Raquelme and Critical Race Theory and Schools by DeCure. So first I'm going to talk about how the two articles intersected. Both articles talked about the different effects that culture can have in different situations. So the first article talked about culture's effects on communication and the whole assessment and treatment plan in the speech-language pathology profession. So if the speech path isn't familiar with or sensitive to the different cultures of their clients, then they'll have a harder time making the right diagnosis or right treatment plans. So for example, if English isn't the primary language of a patient, then this will definitely affect how they perform during an assessment that's in all English. So if the speech path doesn't take into account the different cultures of people, then they'll likely misdiagnose them and then send them on the wrong treatment plan. And the second article talked more about how Black students at Wells Academy were treated differently because they were Black. So because their school was predominantly white, the African American students felt culturally isolated from the rest of the school. And the other students and teachers at the school were not culturally competent because they didn't really understand or respect the differences of their Black peers. So this made the Black students feel alienated from the rest of the school. Another way that the two articles intersected was their discussion on stereotyping. So the first article made it a point that clinicians have to provide their services in an unbiased and non-judgmental way, and this gives all of their clients the best quality of services, and it also prevents misdiagnosis or mistreatment. So with the world becoming increasingly diverse, each speech path has to be aware of each of their patients' customs and beliefs, but they also have to make it a priority to not make assumptions just because someone comes from that particular group or culture. So to provide the best service, speech paths should really take into account the individual person and their personal background and not rely on what they think about their culture. So being aware about all of these also helps reduce the potential for stereotyping. So a clinician cannot make the assumption that all people from a particular group or culture fit into all of the same categories. So it's really important to look at each individual individually and find the best practices for them that way. And the second article talked about how stereotyping played a role in Malcolm's first day of school. So Malcolm was an African American student, and he explained that on his first day of his freshman year, everybody just asked him if he played football and what his 40-meter dash time was before even just saying hello to him or asking him his name. And because all the black guys at his school played on some sort of athletic team and the overall stereotype of being good at sports, everyone just assumed that Malcolm was the same as them. So stereotyping makes people think that everyone within a certain group shares the same characteristics. So in this case, that all black males are athletic and good at sports. And this is really harmful because it puts all of those kids into a bubble when they're capable of doing many more things and they have a lot of different skills and interests. So both articles also talked about bias in everyday life and how it's just apparent in everything. The first article talked about how differences in culture are often overlooked when providing services to someone with a communication or swelling disorder. The clinician might display ethnocentrism and put their own group above the group of their patient while assessing or evaluating them. The article also mentioned that it's common for the service provider to focus only on the language barrier issue and to not take into account all of the other cultural factors that might be in play in the communication process. So this shows that they're already in favor of one thing against another before they even learn anything about their patient. And this can be harmful because it could lead to, like I said before, misdiagnosis or mistreatment because they're putting their own feelings ahead of the actual person and their needs. The second article talked about how racism is a permanent component of American life, and you can find it in all political, economic, and social situations. So racism can be both a conscious and an unconscious act, but it still happens in everyday life. And this is no different in education, which is shown by all the experiences of the black students we're facing in the article. So ultimately, this just puts whites at the top and gives them all of the privileges and others, peoples of color. Assimilation and acculturation were also issues that both articles talked about. The first article discussed the differences between the two. So assimilation is when someone in a new environment totally embraces the host culture, and acculturation is when someone can continue to identify with their original culture and with a new culture that they're in. So acculturation acculturation is more positive because it doesn't make people totally abandon their first culture, and it's more of just a balance between the two. So the United States in the past usually wanted to assimilate the immigrants that came, and that meant abandoning their original culture to join the US's. But after that, many began to acculturate, so it could be a balance of both of the cultures. The second article talked about how an African American girl wanted to wear an African head wrap to her graduation, but it wasn't white. And at the school, everyone had to wear white to the graduation. It was just a rule that they had. So, because there was nothing in Africa that was already white that she could wear, she had to go out of her way to go get a headdress made that was white. And the main point of this is that the girl had to go out of her way to match the views and the rules that the school had. I think that her school kind of expected her to assimilate into their culture and just match everyone else and do that by giving up wearing her headdress. And she went through acculturation because she modified a part of her culture by making her own white headdress as a result of the school's rule. So she, in all, made a balance as a result of what the school's regulations were about the students' dress code at graduation. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how the articles connect with my experiences. So the first article talked about working with patients who are bilingual, and it talked about the importance in recognizing this when working with them. So I have had experiences with growing up simultaneously bilingual because I was exposed to two languages at an early age. So outside of my home, when I was at school or with friends or just anywhere outside, I would get English language input, and then when I was home, I got Cantonese language input from my family. So I got a pretty balanced input of both languages throughout my life. So because I've had this experience, in the future I'll be able to better understand my bilingual patients better. So the first article talked about how you can't give a bilingual child the same test as a monolingual English speaker because there's just a lot of differences that can lead to misdiagnosis of a communication disorder when it's really just a language difference. The second article talked about how their school, Wells Academy, was hiring one African American teacher to help with the school's whole diversity initiative, and they really tried to diversify the school and the curriculum to create a more inclusive schooling environment, but just hiring one person to do that doesn't really do the job. So I related a lot to the second article because I went to very predominantly white schools my whole life, and I always remembered my schools talking about how diversity and inclusion was important, but they didn't really do anything about it to really make it seem like it was important to them. So all of my teachers were white, and most of the students at my school were also white. So I didn't really see a lot of diversity. So I did feel singled out a lot of times, like the students in the article did. But I don't think that this was all my school's fault or anything like that because they can't really help that most of the people who lived in the area were white. But I think it would have been nice to be able to see and be able to relate to people that looked like me and could share experiences with me. Okay, the next slides are about how the articles connect with my professional aspirations. So one big takeaway that I got from the first article is that information is one of the most powerful tools that an SLP can have. So if I'm able to collect more and more data from the client and their family and their community and just their individual personality, I'll be more likely to diagnose them correctly and give them a better experience overall. A good point that the article made was that cultural information is not just background information that you want in the back of your pocket. It's an important aspect that needs to be included front and center to make the best plan for a patient. So it'll also be really important for me to work collaboratively with ESL teachers or classroom teachers and the patient's parents in the future because I want to make sure that I'm making the best materials that my clients can connect to so that they can get the best out of their learning. So a good way to do that, I think, is just working with the other people to find out what works best and collecting all that information and data. The first article also highlighted that all clinicians and patients are culturally and linguistically diverse, and it's important for the SLP to be sensitive to how culture and diversity play into the roles of our clients and just not make assumptions based on different stereotypes that we may be familiar with. So they also explained how language is a resource, so non-English speakers should be encouraged to keep their languages. So in the past, language diversity hasn't been something that's really encouraged, and I don't think that's fair because someone shouldn't have to throw away their whole culture and a huge part of their life just because it doesn't match the majority culture that they're living in. So obviously most people think that knowing more than one language is beneficial because throughout middle school, high school, students are required to learn a different language like Spanish or German or French. So I think it's kind of interesting how non-native English speakers, they're encouraged to lose their first language and just focus on English when the first language English students are trying to learn more than just English. So overall, I think that I'm going to encourage anyone that I see in the future to maintain their culture and never want them to break away from it. And relating this back to the second article a little more, in my future profession, I don't want anyone to feel singled out or uncelebrated like the kids in the second article felt. I want them to be able to be free and proud to talk about where they come from and be able to express it through their clothes, music, traditions, or whatever else they might want to do. And then one of the big ideas of the second article that I took away was that racism is prevalent everywhere. So the African American students at Wells Academy felt alienated from the rest of the school, and this is something that I don't want anyone that I work with in the future to feel. So the critical race theory looks at how racism is not just a single bias, but actually something that is embedded in all aspects of society. So by looking at racism and its effects through the critical race theory, I'll be better able to understand the issues that students are going through. So it's important to look at the role that race has when thinking about my future as an SLP. I need to better understand the history of racism in the context of like the education and the healthcare system specifically, because these are two settings that SLPs practice in a lot. The first article made it clear that cultural competence is needed to provide services in our increasingly culturally and linguistically diverse world. It allows SLPs to provide services to children from all backgrounds with as little bias as possible. So even though they might not realize it, SLPs could be biased during their assessments and treatments. So that's something that I'm going to be try my best to be aware of and work on when I work as an SLP in the future.